Hello and welcome to the Play Review with me, Douglas Schatz.
And me, Jodi Rylett.
Hi, Jodi.
Hi, Douglas. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. The show that we're talking about today is what one might initially think an unlikely event, a new play about football playing at the National Theatre, a play that also happens to be a huge fan favorite. This is Dear England, written by James Graham, who has earned acclaim for masterfully turning contemporary British history into accessible and thought-provoking theatrical drama, including, for example, the arcane ins and outs of 1970s parliamentary process in this House, the modern evolution of the Labour Party and Labour of Love, the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire scandal in Quiz, Rupert Murdoch's assault on the established British media with his founding of the Sun newspaper in Ink, and more recently, his fascinating recreation of the vituperative TV debates between Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley around the 1968 U.S. Democratic Convention in Best of Enemies, which recently finished its run in the West End, and about which I was lucky enough to talk with James in episode 39 of the Play podcast. Can't resist the plug there, Jodi.
Of course not.
Dear England charts the rise and influence of Gareth Southgate as the manager of the England men's football team from his appointment in 2016. I confess that much as I admire James Graham's ability to synthesize real-life events and create really engaging drama, I came to the idea of this subject with some trepidation. Can one really produce nuanced theater from such a particular popular subject as the England football team? So, my first questions to you, Jodi, are you a football fan? And if so, or if not, how much do you think you need to know or like football to go and enjoy this show?
Interesting. So, am I a football fan? Yes and no. I'm a mother of two sons, so I've spent a lot of time shivering on the side of a muddy football pitch. And so I did get into football. And I also confess, I briefly worked for the FA.
Oh, wow.
So I also have a vested interest in England, and I do enjoy a good old World Cup and a Euros competition. So it's yes and no. I'm definitely not a fan, but I'm not averse to a bit of football.
I would say that you probably know more than the average audience potentially then.
Probably. Yes, I did definitely know more than the average audience, and certainly significantly more than the two American people who were sitting to my right. And a lot of it did go over their heads. So to your second part of the question, do you need to know a lot about football? I would say you don't need to know a lot and be a football fan. You just get more out of it. It's like when I went to see Best of Enemies. Had I just known more about it, I would have got more out of it. Did I still enjoy it as a piece of theatre? Absolutely.
So this show is a lot about football, but it's not just about football, is it?
No, it isn't. It's about toxic masculinity. It's about psychology. I mean, I've got another piece of vested interest in this play in that the job that Pippa Grange does is not entirely dissimilar to the work that I do.
Well, I knew this would be something you'd be interested in because just to explain, Pippa Grange is a psychologist that Gareth Southgate appointed to help with the England team psychologies and with leadership styles. And that's one of the most fascinating subjects, I think, of the play. There are two things I think that stood out for me anyway. The first is how the England team is tied up with our sense of national identity. Now, I realize that in my saying our here, I'm presuming to speak from the perspective of an English fan, which I know I'm not entitled to do. But if you'll just humor me for these purposes, and arguably the principles being raised apply to any country and their relationship with national sport. Don't get me started on ice hockey in Canada. Anyway, one of Graham's points is about how the story we tell ourselves about our national team is intrinsic to our sense of ourselves as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that whole part of the play where he's talking about rewriting that story is very beautiful. He recounts what are the facts here? Every time we go into a national tournament, we think it's coming home, our hopes are raised. And then he goes through the woeful actual facts of England's performance in these competitions through the ages. And it's the ultimate triumph of hope over experience. And then he plays beautifully to the theatre audience, talking about a 3-act play, essentially, a 3-act story. And he gets the young team to talk about the Star Wars trilogy by way of bringing that to life. I thought that was very funny.
Very clever. In fact, yes, and it is very clever structurally in that sense that Graham self-consciously compares Southgate's plan to rebuild England's system and fortunes over 3 tournaments to a 3-act play or story. And of course, as we just suggested, that underlines the idea or theme that we are creating stories, and he is creating stories, and the national team is creating a story which we relate to. As you say, this story is often not a very truthful one. In the case of English football, the expectations of success and the assumption of superiority have always been out of sync, really, with the true position and potential of the team. I mean, the record speaks for itself, as you just said. No World Cup victories for more than 50 years and many ignominious failures. So what Graham and Southgate say is that fans are clinging and the country's clinging to an old story, and they need a new story about England's place in the history and hierarchy of world football. So he's basically saying, be honest about ourselves as a starting point. And I thought that was really interesting. For me, it was hard not to hear or see connections between this vainglorious view of the football team and an inflated idea of Britain's place in the world generally, based on distant history, for example, a view of which arguably one could say partly fueled Brexit even. So I thought those kind of resonances were fascinating.
Yeah, they absolutely were. And so it's not a perfect play, which I know we'll get onto, but those aspects make it so nuanced and so much more than a play about football. And also, in anyone who read the newspapers around that time, you go into this play knowing about this young team, those young men who took those penalties and got that horrendous racist backlash, and the way that they rose above it with such dignity as it was leading up to that moment. I just felt such dread because it's coming. You know what's coming to these boys.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to that element of it particularly, but you're right. It is interesting to watch it when you know some of the results, of course, because it is a bit of history. And it's also designed, as we've said, in some way to be a state of the nation kind of statement. How does the national team reflect the country and vice versa? How does the national team affect the country? And I found it just even more generally fascinating, the subject of how much we invest in the success or otherwise of these sports figures and the national team. Why is it so important? Because it's clear that in these major tournaments that you mentioned, you watch that, the World Cup and the Euros, the hysteria is just phenomenal when they get wrapped up in the success or the backlash when they fail. Why is it so important? There's some strain of that going on in the play, I think.
Yeah, there is. If you're a fan of sport, if you are a fan of football, it's less surprising to see that degree of hysteria and joy and misery associated with a game of football. I grew up in the northeast of England where football, it's not just a game. It's that tribalism, that connection, that pride, particularly a part of the world that there wasn't much money, it was quite deprived. So you imbued your team's success and failures with some degree of supremacy, and it gave you something to believe in, some sort of tribalism, some sense of belonging. So I do understand it. And I guess that at the national level, that's just this local piece amplified now onto, say, the world stage. And, sport is ripe for plays and films. It is inherently a dramatic thing. The stakes are so high.
That's true. And I think you're right, though, about how important it is. It's something to do with self-worth.
It is.
There's a reflection of that to us as individuals. And then, of course, as you say, amplified to us as a country. The collective hopes, dreams, and failures, how we feel about ourselves, is influenced by what happens in sport. And it's interesting, this connection between the country and the team, because that's the source of the play, isn't it? That originally Southgate actually wrote a letter to the nation in the press headed Dear England, outlining some of his thoughts about how we should think about the national team. He also, as we discover in the play, encouraged and coached the players to be more open about themselves through the media, So as you said about those penalty takers, that the public would connect with them as human beings as well, not just as overpaid, famous ciphers of sport, so that they can really have a go at them when they fail. But if they know them as human beings, then that puts it in a better perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was the genius of him bringing in Pippa Grange, whose job is not just as a psychologist, but also as a culture coach. So she worked with organizations to help change the culture. So he recognized that this isn't about individual team performance, it's about a deep-seated culture that needed some deep-seated work. And, he was a visionary in that regard.
Absolutely. And this was the other strand in the play that I most enjoyed, and that you touched on at the beginning, that I'm sure you recognize with your professional hat on, which is to do with leadership and culture, and how Southgate brought this determined and very thoughtful change in the culture of the team, using Dr. Pippa Grange, who was a very engaging character, I have to say. I thought she was really lovelily played by Gina McKee, and Southgate also played by Joseph Fiennes, which is, again, an uncanny performance, capturing Southgate's demeanor and voice, but also his quiet intelligence and his steely determination. And I thought their scenes together were possibly the best thing in the play, frankly, partly because of my interest, like you, in leadership from a professional life. And those elements that you would recognize, I'm sure, that he and she were trying to work on in the culture of the team. Encouraging honesty and openness to create trust, for example, leveling out some of the hierarchies, building a sense of collective responsibility when they were all actually not working together much previously, and also how they dealt with pressure and their response to pressure and routines to manage pressure situations like taking penalties. It seems so obvious to us, I'm sure to you, Jodi.
Yeah.
All this stuff, but it was absolutely radical, I think,
yes,
in a sports environment like the England football team at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree that those scenes were so lovely and powerful. And what I also liked was the additional piece when she starts turning the conversation to him and his history and what's he not talking about and what's he not processing, and the way he closed down and sort of rejected that and took a long time to process, oh yeah, I really need to slay this dragon myself, of his failed penalty and his associations with failure. It was very layered and nuanced. So I personally would have liked more of that in the play, or it could almost be an entirely separate two-hander in a way.
Yeah, I thought those two things that we just talked about, the connection between the team and national identity and this exploration of leadership and culture, were the most interesting things about it. And actually, the transformation of the team culture is, in effect, the central arc through the play that holds the structure. What he's doing is this journey from before to after, with the unity of the team and apparently healthier ability to recover from the trauma of losing. And of course, like all, as you mentioned, the drama of sports stories, you get these feel-good endings often. Although they didn't win,
well, that's it. So
they win in a different way, right?
Yeah. So I found that really interesting as an audience member. So I'm sat there, I'm very swept up in the story, and I'm with the team believing in this 3-act play, and then they're going to go and they're going to win. And at the interval, I went with a friend who was confused as to why I would bring her to a play about kickball. And she was saying, oh, it's so great, so great. And I was like, oh no, I've just realized this does not end well. that third tournament does not go the way that they're expecting it to. And I was sat there with quite a knot in my stomach the whole of that second half, thinking, how are they going to end this? How am I going to leave this play feeling anything other than hollowed out, with like the gutting misery you get every time England loses yet another tournament on penalties? So I loved that redemptive ending, that culture had changed, and not just in the FA. It had changed in England, because the response to them not going so far in that final tournament was not the violence in the streets and so on. Something had changed. That's huge.
Yeah, I have to say, I think that's a somewhat...
I think it was trite?
Sentimental and slightly trite wrapping up, a bit pat. And actually, what I thought was fascinating was at the very end, an extraordinary moment people have referred to, which is that the whole of the audience in the National Theatre are on their feet singing Sweet Caroline along with the cast on the stage.
Yeah.
Now, The thing that I loved about that is this sort of meta level of it, which touches on what we were talking about before, where Graham talks about how the nation gets swept up, the connection between the national team and the public, and its sense of identity and patriotism and hope. And there we had it actually played out, where these people are on their feet cheering and singing. And actually, this is all fiction, of course.
It's all made up.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, you're all deluded, people. What are you doing?
You fell for it.
Yes, exactly.
I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to get on my feet and sing.
Oh, see, so Graham has proved the point with us all leaping up like that.
Yep.
And I was slightly disturbed by that. I thought, I'm not sure this is actually, well, anyway, you leave the theater with the hope, right? And I guess that's better than the reverse, better than the despair.
It's a couple of things. I think you leave with the hope and you leave with a sense of collectivism. You know, we were as one, all elated, singing along, knowing that it was all just a little bit ridiculous, but nonetheless joyful. And that's a great thing. And that also for me, and I know I can get quite sentimental about theatre and community theatre and so on, but this is also it. This is why going to see live sport and why people go to pubs and watch it on the TV when they could watch it at home. It's experiencing something together, those emotions, those highs, those lows, and then talking about it on the way back. I love hearing the chatter as you come out of the theatre, down the steps, walking to Waterloo, maybe sitting next to somebody on the train and they're talking about it. I love all that aspect of it. Can we talk about the set a little bit?
Oh, yes. And the staging. Yeah. What did you think of that?
I thought it was very, very, very clever. So first of all, it's essentially two neon ovals that emulate the Wembley arches. And they move up and open oyster-like, and one of the oval rings hovers above the stage for the longest time. And I don't know whether it was intentional or whether I'm reading too much into it, but it felt to me like that ring hovered above Gareth Southgate's head. And underlined by that moment when the Stormzy song, "Heavy is the Head That Wears the Crown," it's a thankless job being the England manager.
Yes.
But I thought that it was just so simple. It was so evocative of a physical thing and also of a metaphorical thing. So I absolutely loved that. And then it also served a storytelling clarity purpose, because it also became the projection around the top that was a bit like a football scoreboard. And also it very handily helped us with the exposition. Player was introduced, their name in lights, their number, they came on, they did their little, this is their signature move. That was all clever. And they had doorways that emulated their locker room. I thought it was very, very simple, but very clever and served the story very well.
Yeah, and the staging is fluent and full of exuberant energy, as you might expect, with the athletes running around a lot, making impressive use of the huge Olivier stage. And they recreated the noise of the stadia, and they had widescreen projections that helped to broadcast milestones of the matches. All of that was, as you say, very effective for exposition. In fact, actually, I think going back to the structure, the play was also too long.
Yeah.
It's nearly 3 hours, and in some ways a bit repetitive. So by definition, you have these sequence of tournaments, and they just repeat the same thing with penalties and games and outcomes. And actually, that was a bit too much the same. But you're right. They made wonderful use of the stage and the resources they have in the National Theatre, I think. You said earlier, this play isn't perfect.
No, it isn't.
What were your quibbles?
So I had some quibbles around, there was some cheap tricks, throwing in impersonations of prime ministers, etc.
Yeah.
That felt a bit shoehorned in. They went down well. And, I laughed along, but it did feel a bit gratuitous.
Completely. I agree with you completely. They're pointless, frankly. I was cross about them. They're cheap.
Yeah.
They don't add anything serious to the play.
Yeah. The other piece, and I don't know whether this was to do with where we were sitting, although there isn't really a bad seat in the Olivier, but when there were all those very cleverly choreographed scenes that showed the general public all moving around, walking around, talking about the game, it was all very clever. The only problem was I couldn't follow who was talking, who was saying what.
Well, I just thought those weren't very successful either. There wasn't really much focus in those. I didn't think they were necessary. And also, just to add to that, superfluous elements, the impersonation, so to speak, of the previous England football managers.
Yeah.
also totally unnecessary, I thought. And again, people laugh at them if you know these people. But again, it just seemed to cheapen the play to me.
It did, it lowered it. Although, like an Easter egg in stories or in video games or whatever, it was a bit like that. It was a bit of a throwing the sweeties out. The crowd was in that Olivier theatre that ordinarily wouldn't go, right? There were a lot of men in the audience, way more than typically you would see. And I thought, you know what? It's fun. They're liking it,
Absolutely. The audience lap it up. And actually, the point is, the more you know those people, then, of course, the more you lap it up.
Yeah.
They are caricatures. It's interesting that Graham walked quite a fine line in rendering the famous footballers themselves, of course, because we have Harry Kane and Harry Maguire and Jordan Pickford and all these England players on the stage. And he's pretty good at crafting funny, albeit one-note characterizations for these figures. I have to say it felt a little bit like Spitting Image or something, where they are funny, particularly if you know the players, but they are very one note. And he did milk them a little bit at times, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And I'm not sure if you were them, how you'd feel about your own puppet, so to speak, on the stage.
Yeah.
And again, some of that had to do with how well you knew them. So you were talking about the Americans who sat next to you, was it? I had a lady who turned to me at the interval, and she said to me, "You've been laughing at lots of stuff I don't think I'm really getting." And it was basically because she doesn't know who these players are. So the fact that Jordan Pickford is a lunatic jumping up and down in his goal, you just have to know that that's what he is, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, there were some other things I thought were a bit more seriously wrong. I mean, these are cheap elements you can easily sort of excise if you choose to, or just allow. But I also think that there were things which he touched on, but basically paid lip service to, and that ultimately the play tries to throw in too many ingredients and is baggy as a result. So things like, in passing, the women's England football team and the women as poor cousins of the men. Well, okay, in and out.
Different story.
Yeah.
Worthy of a full examination.
Exactly.
I know it was skated over. The Women's World Cup win.
Euros.
The Euros win, sorry. I really, really enjoyed that. The impersonation of Serena Wiegmann was good. Her casually holding one of her numerous championship trophies, her gentle ribbing of Southgate, him, no thanks, I don't really want to hold the trophy, thank you very much. I had a little chuckle years ago when I worked at the FA briefly. One of the key pillars of that strategy was to develop the women's game and really invest in it and take it seriously. And over the years, this is what it's culminated in. So that's a happy story. That's the next play I would very much like to see written, please.
Well, it's come a long way. And as I said earlier, I think there's more in that. And it was a bit of lip service to that. And even more egregiously, I would say, the treatment of the racist incidents that you referred to, when 3 black players missed the penalties in the Euros final, and the backlash they got on social media in this country was just despicable. And I felt that all of that was skated over rather superficially. Has to be said that to cover such a subject would probably require a whole play in itself, another play. But again, I would just come back to the point where I feel like there were too many ingredients.
Yeah, I think so too.
So it didn't do justice to some of those things. My son, for example, suggested on the theme of the racism, he was quite cross it didn't address this more strongly, was that they could have showed, for example, some of the actual language that was being tweeted out at the time, which was vile. Because the reason I say that is he makes a point about saying, this is a play about what England is to you. What do you think England is? And there's a scene where he asks the players, what is England to you? And this is England. This is part of what England is. And I think that they skated over that part.
Yeah, I think that's true. I still felt it very keenly, but I suppose I felt it very keenly because I did know the depth of vile hatred and what had really been poured upon those boys, essentially. So, yeah, maybe without that context and that knowledge, I think you're right. It would seem superfluous. I think the other thing, I suppose, is that the purpose of telling that part of the story as well could be that it serves more the story of the change and the breaking down of that sort of toxic masculinity where everybody just copes and it's banter and come on, ignore it, chin up, move on. It gives them a moment for their connection and compassion and their collective carrying each other up, which I thought played very well. I felt that very deeply. I found that actually very, very moving, just to see them getting their arms around each other literally and hearkening back to the earlier silly dad dancing that one of them had been doing in this way that, these things are unspeakably awful. This is the context that we are living in and operating in. And it's only by changing the way that we are and inviting each other in and connecting with each other that we will get past all of that. And hopefully those little pockets will grow and grow and grow. So I did think that part of the story was served.
That's a very good point, because actually when I say what I said about the treatment of that incident and the response, one of the elements of the response that I would want included in any treatment of that is the response of others in the country who responded against the racism that was being expressed in social media and stood up for these boys.
Yeah.
And that was also a feature of what happened. So an indication that things are potentially changing. Anyway, yeah, so I thought in the end, my question also was about the whole play. How well do you think it will stand up over time? Because that's the thing about those parodies of the political figures.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Yeah, it'll be meaningless. That will fall away unless it becomes one of those ones, potentially a bit like Accidental Death of an Anarchist, which I know we've both seen recently, where it lives a little and it gets updated based upon whatever the current political context might be. So there is that option, because the themes around leadership, around team, around toxic masculinity, all of that should stand the test of time.
I agree, which is why I think the topical references, you almost insert them like pantomime. I don't even think they're necessary in the play. And what I came out of the theater thinking was that it was very funny and the exploration of national identity and leadership were thought-provoking. But I kept thinking there's a leaner, meaner play within this baggy first draft almost that could be a better long-term letter to the nation, so to speak.
Yeah, agreed, definitely. And that may well be what happens with it.
Dear England is running at the National Theatre until the 11th of August, but I'm pleased to say that you will have another chance to cheer when it transfers to the Prince Edward Theatre in the West End from the 9th of October. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time at the Play Review.
See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening. I'd love to hear what you think. So please visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast to share your views on this production or any other play that you've seen. See you next time.